During a routine morning patrol, an officer pulled over a speeding vehicle lacking emergency lights or sirens. He expected a simple traffic violation, but was instead met with a frantic nurse, desperately trying to rush an unconscious patient to the hospital. In that fleeting moment, as the emergency blanket shifted to reveal a glimpse of familiar dark, curly hair, time seemed to stop. The dying child in the passenger seat was his own son, who should have been safely at school. His world shattered in an instant, and the truth behind how his son ended up in that seat would soon unleash a father's worst nightmare. Watch until the end to find out what happened. This story today is a special one you don't want to miss. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows of the Reed family home, warming the breakfast table. Malcolm Reed, already dressed in his crisp police uniform, stood by the counter, sipping his coffee while watching his 10-year-old son, Jason, pick at his breakfast. The boy's reluctance was palpable, his fork pushing the scrambled eggs around the plate without any real intention of eating. Martha Reed, Malcolm's wife, moved around the kitchen with the practiced ease of a morning routine, her voice carrying a note of motherly concern as she noticed Jason's unusual quietness. "Jason, honey, you need to eat something. It's going to be a long day at school." Jason mumbled something inaudible, his eyes fixed on his plate. Malcolm glanced at his watch, realizing they were running late. He was about to urge Jason to hurry up when he noticed the boy's slumped shoulders and downcast eyes. Something was clearly bothering his son. "Jason," Malcolm said, his tone softening slightly, "what's wrong? Are you feeling sick?" Jason shook his head, still not meeting his father's gaze. "I don't want to go to school," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm exchanged a worried look with Martha before approaching Jason. He knelt beside his son's chair, trying to catch his eye. "Is it the bullies again? Are Ellum and Edric still giving you trouble?" Jason nodded slowly, tears welling up in his eyes. Malcolm felt a mixture of anger and concern rising in his chest. He had hoped the school's reinforced anti-bullying program would have put an end to this, but clearly the problem persisted. "Let me see," Malcolm said gently, his eyes scanning his son for any visible signs of bullying. It was then that he noticed Jason's feet, partially hidden under the table. The boy's toenails were black and peeling, clear evidence of recent trauma. "Jason, what happened to your feet?" Jason's lower lip trembled as he recounted the incident. "Ellum and Edric. They made me run barefoot on the walkway a few days ago. They said children with my skin color often run around without shoes, so I don't need them." Malcolm felt a surge of rage at the racist taunts, but he forced himself to remain calm for Jason's sake. He took a deep breath, his mind racing with thoughts of how to handle the situation. As a police officer, he had dealt with numerous bullying cases, but when it came to his own son, he found himself struggling to separate his professional instincts from his parental emotions. "Jason," Malcolm began, his voice carrying the authority of both a father and a law enforcement officer, "you need to stand up for yourself. Remember those self-defense techniques I taught you? You should use them if they try to hurt you again." Martha, overhearing the conversation, interjected softly, "Malcolm, he's just 10. Malcolm held up a hand, silencing her protest. 10 is the perfect age to learn how to be strong, Martha. We can't protect him forever." Jason looked up at his father, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. "But Dad, what if I get in trouble for fighting back?" Malcolm shook his head firmly. "You won't be in trouble for defending yourself, son. It's important that you show those bullies you're not an easy target. That's the only way to make them stop." Jason hesitated for a moment before asking timidly, "Could I maybe have some pepper spray? Or a mini taser?" Malcolm's expression hardened slightly. "No, Jason. Those could get you in serious trouble at school if they fall into the wrong hands. You need to prove your bravery through physical confrontation first. Use the techniques I taught you." Martha watched the exchange with growing concern, her maternal instincts clashing with Malcolm's tough love approach. As Jason reluctantly nodded and stood up to leave, she tried one last time to get him to eat. "Jason, please, just one more bite before you go." Malcolm, however, was already ushering Jason towards the door. "Stop babying him, Martha. He's 10. If he's hungry, he can get food at the school cafeteria later. We're running late. As Jason headed to the car, Martha confronted Malcolm in a hushed but heated tone. "Malcolm, don't you think you're being a bit too harsh? He's just a child." Malcolm's jaw set in a firm line. "Martha, this is the only way he'll learn. Life isn't always sunshine and rainbows. We need to prepare him for the real world." "But pushing him to fight? There must be another way," Martha pleaded. Malcolm's voice softened slightly, but his resolve remained firm. "Sometimes people can only learn to be strong when they're cornered or driven by a pressing situation. We can't protect him forever, Martha. He needs to learn to protect himself." With that, Malcolm gave Martha a quick goodbye kiss and headed out to the car where Jason was waiting. As he settled into the driver's seat, he could see the conflict and worry etched on his son's face. For a moment, Malcolm felt a twinge of doubt about his approach, but he quickly pushed it aside. This was for Jason's own good, he told himself. It was the only way to ensure his son would grow up strong and capable in a world that wouldn't always be kind to him. As they pulled out of the driveway, the morning sun glinted off the polished surface of Malcolm's police cruiser, a symbol of protection and authority that now seemed to cast a long shadow over the father and son as they embarked on what would prove to be a fateful day. The patrol car glided smoothly through the quiet morning streets, its interior filled with a heavy silence that hung between Malcolm and Jason. The boy sat in the passenger seat, his small frame turned slightly away from his father, eyes fixed on the passing scenery outside the window. Malcolm gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles whitening as he struggled with the conflicting emotions churning inside him. As a police officer, Malcolm had been trained to handle difficult situations with calm authority. But as a father, he found himself at a loss for words. He wanted to offer encouragement, to somehow bridge the gap that seemed to be widening between them. But every time he opened his mouth to speak, the words died on his lips. Malcolm's mind raced, replaying the morning's conversation. Had he been too harsh? Should he have taken a different approach? His law enforcement training told him that strength and self-reliance were crucial, especially for a young black boy growing up in their community. But his parental instincts whispered that perhaps Jason needed something else. Understanding, comfort, or maybe just a listening ear. The car rolled to a stop at a red light, and Malcolm seized the moment to glance at his son. Jason's reflection in the window showed a face etched with worry, his young features carrying a weight no child should bear. Malcolm's heart clenched, and he nearly reached out to pat Jason's shoulder, to offer some gesture of comfort. But before he could act, the light turned green, and the moment passed. As they neared the school, Malcolm cleared his throat, finally breaking the silence. "Remember, son," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. "Use those defense tactics if you need to. Don't let them push you around." Jason nodded silently, his eyes still fixed on the world outside the car. They pulled into the school parking lot, the car coming to a stop near the main entrance. Jason unbuckled his seatbelt and reached for his backpack, his movements slow and reluctant. As he opened the door to step out, Malcolm felt a sudden urge to say something more, to somehow make things right. "Jason," he called out, causing the boy to pause and look back. Malcolm rolled down the window, leaning towards his son. "Remember what I taught you. You're strong, son. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Jason nodded again, a flicker of something, was it determination or resignation, passing across his face. "Okay, Dad," he said softly before turning and walking towards the school entrance. Malcolm watched his son's retreating figure, noting the slump of his shoulders and the dragging of his feet. The sight painted a picture of resignation rather than the confidence Malcolm had hoped to instill. For a moment, he debated getting out of the car, marching into the principal's office to demand action against the bullies. But then he remembered his own words about self-reliance and standing up for oneself. With a heavy sigh, Malcolm put the car in drive. He lingered in the parking lot for a few more minutes, watching as Jason disappeared into the school building. The father in him wanted to rush in to protect his child from the cruelties of the world, but the police officer in him insisted that this was a necessary lesson, a crucial step in Jason's growth. Finally, with one last look at the school, Malcolm drove away, the gnawing feeling in his gut growing with each passing mile. He tried to convince himself that he had made the right decision, that Jason needed to learn these hard lessons. But as he headed towards the police station, a nagging doubt persisted, whispering that perhaps, just perhaps, he had made a terrible mistake. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the town as Malcolm's patrol car disappeared around a corner, leaving behind a school where unseen dangers lurked, and a young boy faced his fears alone. Malcolm's patrol car cruised slowly down Main Street, the mid-morning sun glinting off its polished surface. He had been on duty for a couple of hours now, his mind still preoccupied with thoughts of Jason and their tense morning exchange. The routine nature of checking parking meters and writing tickets provided little distraction from his inner turmoil. As he moved methodically down the street, Malcolm's trained eyes scanned the parked cars, looking for expired meters or parking violations. The mundane task felt at odds with the emotional weight he carried. Each ticket he wrote a stark contrast to the complex family drama playing out in his mind. Suddenly, a flash of white caught Malcolm's attention. A Dodge Grand Caravan with a red hospital cross emblazoned on its side sped past him, clearly exceeding the speed limit. Malcolm's police instincts kicked in immediately, pushing his personal concerns to the background. Without hesitation, he slid into the driver's seat of his patrol car, flipped on the siren, and pulled out to pursue the speeding vehicle. The chase was brief. The medivan, recognizing the police presence, quickly pulled over to the side of the road. Malcolm approached the vehicle cautiously, his hand resting lightly on his holster out of habit. As he neared the driver's side window, he saw a blue-uniformed nurse behind the wheel. Her face was a mixture of panic and professional composure, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "License and registration, please," Malcolm said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he'd perfected over years on the force. The nurse fumbled in her purse, producing the requested documents along with her hospital ID. Malcolm noted her name, Nancy Mulligan. As he examined the papers, Nancy spoke, her voice urgent but controlled. "Officer, I know I was speeding, but I have an emergency. There's an unconscious boy in the passenger seat. He needs immediate medical attention." Malcolm's gaze shifted to the passenger seat, where he could see a small figure wrapped in an emergency blanket, an oxygen mask covering most of the child's face. The sight sent a chill down his spine, reminding him uncomfortably of his own son. Despite the obvious urgency of the situation, Malcolm's training compelled him to ask more questions. "Why aren't you using an ambulance? And why is the patient in the front seat?" Nancy's explanation came in a rush of words. "All our ambulances are out on other calls. This is a hospital car, and I had to use it because of how dire the situation is. I secured him in the front seat so I could monitor him for internal bleeding and ensure he was safely restrained. If I lay him at the back, he might choke with blood or vomit, and sudden movement may cause further injuries." Malcolm nodded, processing the information. He glanced again at the unconscious child, a nagging feeling of familiarity tugging at the back of his mind. The emergency blanket shifted slightly, revealing a glimpse of dark, curly hair that reminded him of Jason. But surely it couldn't be. Pushing the unsettling thought aside, Malcolm focused on the task at hand. He quickly jotted down the vehicle details and Nancy's information. "All right, Ms. Mulligan. I understand the emergency, but please be careful. Safety first, even in urgent situations." Nancy nodded gratefully. "Thank you, officer. I promise to be more cautious." As Malcolm stepped back from the vehicle, allowing it to pull away, he couldn't shake the gnawing sense of unease that had settled in his stomach. He watched the medivan speed off, its white form growing smaller in the distance, carrying with it a child whose identity remained a mystery. Malcolm had just resumed his patrol duties, his mind still wrestling with the unsettling encounter with the speeding medivan. The image of the unconscious child kept flashing in his thoughts, but he forced himself to focus on the task at hand. He was in the process of checking another row of parked cars when his phone rang, the school's number flashing on the screen. With a mixture of anticipation and dread, Malcolm answered. "Officer Reed speaking." "Mr. Reed, this is Ms. Catherine, Jason's homeroom teacher. came a concerned voice from the other end. "I'm calling because Jason hasn't been in class, not just today, but for the past 3 days. We've been trying to reach you." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Malcolm processed this information. "What do you mean?" "I drove Jason to school myself this morning. I watched him walk into the building." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reed, but Jason hasn't been in class. Are you sure he entered the school?" Malcolm's mind raced, replaying the morning's events. He had watched Jason walk towards the school entrance, but had he actually seen him go inside? I need to go," he stammered, ending the call abruptly. Heart pounding, Malcolm jumped into his patrol car and sped towards St. Louis Children's Hospital, the same direction the medivan had gone. As he drove, he dialed the hospital's number, his fingers trembling as he pressed the buttons. "St. Louis Children's Hospital, how may I help you?" a receptionist answered. "This is Officer Malcolm Reed," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "I'm calling about a boy who might have been brought in recently. He's 10 years old, African-American, wearing a school uniform. I think he might be my son." There was a pause, the sound of typing in the background. "Yes, we did receive a boy matching that description a short while ago. He was brought in by one of our nurses in a hospital vehicle." Malcolm's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white. "Is he okay? What happened?" "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't disclose medical information over the phone. You'll need to come to the hospital." Malcolm barely heard the rest of the receptionist's words. His mind was a whirlwind of panic and guilt. How could this have happened? How had he not realized something was wrong? As he sped towards the hospital, sirens blaring, Malcolm's phone rang again. It was Bradley Johnson, his superior officer. "Malcolm, where are you?" Bradley's voice brimmed with concern. "Harmony Hills Elementary just called. There's been an incident. A 10-year-old African-American boy with short, curly hair. My mind immediately went to your son." Malcolm cut him off, his voice choked with emotion. "Bradley, I think it's Jason. I'm heading to the hospital now. I stopped a speeding medivan earlier. I think my son was inside and I didn't even realize it." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "My God, Malcolm, go, take care of your boy. We'll handle things here. Keep me updated." As Malcolm ended the call, the full weight of the situation crashed down on him. His son, his little boy, was hurt, possibly critically, and he had let it happen. The memory of their argument that morning, his insistence on toughness and self-reliance, now felt like a cruel joke. Tears blurred his vision as he pushed the patrol car to its limits, racing through the streets towards the hospital. The morning's events played on repeat in his mind. Jason's reluctance, the signs of bullying he had dismissed, his own harsh words. How could he have been so blind? As the hospital came into view, Malcolm's heart hammered in his chest. He didn't know what condition he would find Jason in, but one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. The day that had started with a father's misguided attempt to toughen up his son had spiraled into a nightmare, and Malcolm knew that whatever happened next, he would carry the weight of this morning's decisions for the rest of his life. Malcolm's patrol car screeched to a halt in the hospital parking lot, the tires leaving dark marks on the asphalt. He burst out of the vehicle, his police uniform a stark contrast to the panic etched across his face. The automatic doors of the emergency entrance barely had time to slide open before Malcolm rushed through, his shoes squeaking against the polished floor as he raced to the information desk. "My son," he gasped, his breath coming in short bursts. "Jason Reed. He was brought in recently. Where is he?" The nurse behind the desk, startled by Malcolm's sudden appearance, quickly typed on her computer. "Yes, Jason Reed. He's currently in the ICU. I'll have someone take you there right away." As a young orderly appeared to guide him, Malcolm turned back to the nurse. "Please, can you contact my wife? Her name is Martha Reed." He rattled off the phone number, his voice cracking with emotion. "Of course, Officer Reed," the nurse replied, jotting down the number before picking up the phone. The journey to the ICU felt like an eternity, each step bringing Malcolm closer to a reality he wasn't sure he was ready to face. As they rounded a corner, Malcolm spotted a familiar figure, Nurse Nancy, the woman he had stopped earlier for speeding. She was sitting in a corner, her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Malcolm approached her cautiously. "Nurse Mulligan?" Nancy looked up, her eyes widening in recognition and then fear. "Officer Reed, I'm so sorry about the speeding. I didn't realize—" "Is there a problem, officer? Am I in trouble?" Malcolm held up a hand, silencing her apologies. "My son, Jason, is he—" Nancy's expression shifted from fear to sorrow. "The boy, he's in there," she said, gesturing to a nearby room. "The doctors are with him now. I'm so sorry, Officer Reed. If I had known it was your son—" Malcolm nodded numbly, unable to form words. He moved towards the room, his heart pounding in his ears. Through the window he could see a small figure on the bed, surrounded by medical equipment. It was Jason, his boy, looking so small and fragile amidst the tubes and wires. A doctor emerged from the room, his face grave. "Mr. Reed, I'm Dr. Flores. Your son is in critical condition. We've had to induce a coma due to the severity of his internal injuries." The words hit Malcolm like physical blows. "Internal injuries? What happened?" Dr. Flores explained the situation. Jason had suffered severe internal bleeding, likely from a fall. The full weight of the morning's events crashed down on Malcolm. His son had been lying injured, possibly dying, while he had been writing parking tickets. As the doctor continued to explain Jason's condition, Malcolm's mind raced. The bullies, the school, his own harsh words that morning, everything swirled together in a maelstrom of guilt and anger. Nurse Nancy approached hesitantly. "Officer Reed, I want you to know that we did everything we could to get Jason here as quickly as possible. Every second counted." Malcolm turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and anguish. "Thank you," he managed to say. I'm sorry I delayed you." Nancy shook her head. "You were doing your job, I understand." As Malcolm stood there, torn between rushing to his son's bedside and demanding answers about what had happened, he heard a commotion down the hall. Martha had arrived, her face a mask of fear and confusion. "Malcolm," she cried, running towards him. "What happened? Where's Jason?" Malcolm embraced his wife, his composure finally cracking. "Martha, I'm so sorry. I should have listened to you this morning. I should have." As Martha peered into Jason's room, her gasp of shock cutting through Malcolm's apologies, the full impact of the day's events settled over them. Their son, their little boy, was fighting for his life, and nothing would ever be the same again. In that moment, standing in the sterile hospital hallway with the beeping of machines providing a grim soundtrack, Malcolm made a silent vow. He would find out exactly what had happened to Jason, and he would make sure those responsible faced justice. But more than that, he promised himself that when Jason recovered, he would be a different father, one who listened more and pushed less, who protected fiercely but also understood deeply. As they prepared to enter Jason's room, Malcolm and Martha clung to each other, drawing strength for the battle ahead. The day had brought devastating revelations, but it was far from over. The fight for Jason's life was just beginning, and Malcolm was determined to be there every step of the way, making up for the morning's mistakes with every ounce of love and determination he possessed. The hours ticked by slowly in the ICU waiting room, each minute feeling like an eternity to Malcolm and Martha. They sat side by side, hands clasped tightly, their eyes fixed on the door leading to Jason's room. The sterile smell of disinfectant and the constant beeping of machines created a surreal atmosphere, a stark reminder of the gravity of their situation. Dr. Flores approached them, her face a mask of professional composure. "Mr. and Mrs. Reed," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "we're still awaiting the official imaging results, but I wanted to update you on Jason's condition." Malcolm and Martha leaned forward, their bodies tense with anticipation. "The immediate concern right now is Jason's severe blood loss from the fall," Dr. Flores explained. "We've induced a coma to help stabilize him, but this is only a temporary solution. What Jason needs urgently is a blood transfusion." Martha's grip on Malcolm's hand tightened. "We'll donate, of course," she said quickly. Dr. Flores shook her head slightly. I'm afraid it's not that simple. Jason has a B blood type. We need to find a compatible donor, and quickly. Malcolm's heart sank as he realized the implications. I'm AB and Martha is O, he said, the words feeling heavy in his mouth. The doctor nodded solemnly. Yes, that rules you both out as donors. We're searching for a suitable match, but time is of the essence. The donor must not only have a compatible blood type, but also a history of frequent donations to ensure the blood is safe for immediate use. The gravity of the situation settled over Malcolm and Martha like a heavy blanket. Their son's life hung in the balance, and they were powerless to provide the very thing he needed most. Martha, her voice shaking but determined, spoke up. I'll start calling family and friends right away. Someone must be able to help. Dr. Flores nodded with encouragement. That's a good start. We're also coordinating with the blood bank, but given Jason's specific needs, finding a match quickly is critical. The doctor hesitated before continuing, her tone more serious. I need to tell you, this doesn't look like an accident. We've observed scratch marks and bruises across his limbs, as well as blackened toenails, clear signs of physical force. Were you aware of this? Malcolm and Martha exchanged a somber look before nodding. We learned about it this morning, Malcolm said. Our boy told us he was being bullied by a schoolmate. Dr. Flores frowned. That aligns with what we're seeing. These injuries were inflicted deliberately. This wasn't a simple fall or accident. It's evidence of aggression. Thank you, Dr. Flores. I'll inform the police investigation team about this and follow up with the school for confirmation. As the doctor excused herself, promising to return with updates, Malcolm and Martha exchanged a look of shared fear and determination. Martha immediately pulled out her phone, her fingers flying over the keypad as she began reaching out to their network of family and friends for blood donor. Malcolm, feeling helpless, stepped out of the waiting room to clear his head. In the hallway, he spotted two of his fellow officers who had responded to the initial call at the school. They approached him, their faces etched with concern. Malcolm, one of them said, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. How's Jason doing? Malcolm shook his head, his voice rough with emotion. Not good. He needs a blood transfusion, but finding a match is proving difficult. The officers exchanged glances before one of them spoke up. Listen, we've got some updates on what happened at the school. Do you want to hear it now, or should we come back later? For a moment, Malcolm was torn. Part of him desperately wanted to know what had happened to his son, to understand how this nightmare had unfolded. But another part of him knew that right now, Jason's immediate medical needs had to take priority. Later, he said finally. Right now, we need to focus on finding a blood donor for Jason. Can you spread the word at the station? Maybe someone there is a match. The officers nodded, promising to do everything they could to help. As they left, Malcolm leaned against the wall, closing his eyes briefly. The weight of the day's events pressed down on him, the guilt of his morning conversation with Jason mixing with the fear of what the future might hold. When he returned to the waiting room, he found Martha still on the phone, her voice tinged with desperation as she explained the situation to yet another person. Malcolm sat down beside her, placing a comforting hand on her back. As they waited for news, good or bad, Malcolm's mind raced with thoughts of what he would do differently when Jason recovered. He silently vowed to be a better father, to listen more, to understand better. But first, Jason had to survive this crisis. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each second a reminder of the precious time slipping away. Malcolm and Martha clung to each other and to hope, praying for a miracle that would save their son's life. As the hours crawled by with no news of a suitable blood donor, Malcolm felt an overwhelming need to do something, anything, to help his son. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating, pushing him towards action. With a quick word to Martha, who was still tirelessly calling everyone they knew, Malcolm left the hospital, his mind set on uncovering the truth about what had happened to Jason. The drive to the school was a blur, the familiar streets passing by unnoticed, as Malcolm's thoughts raced. He pulled into the parking lot, the same spot where he had dropped Jason off that morning. Was it really only this morning? It felt like a lifetime ago. As Malcolm strode towards the main entrance, his police uniform seemed to part the crowds of students and teachers like a physical force. The hallways, once familiar and benign, now felt hostile and foreign. He made his way directly to the principal's office, barely registering the startled looks from the staff he passed. He knocked briskly on the door before stepping into the principal's office, trying to maintain his professionalism despite his frustration. The man behind the desk glanced up, his face paling at the sight of the furious police officer. "Officer Reed," the principal stammered, "We've been trying to reach you." Malcolm cut him off, his voice low and dangerous. "I want to know exactly what happened to my son, and I want to know now." The principal swallowed hard, visibly intimidated by Malcolm's intensity. We're still piecing together the details, but it seems there was an incident on the playground." "An incident?" Malcolm's voice rose. "My son is in a coma. That's not an incident. That's an assault. Where are Ellum and Edric?" The principal's eyes widened at the mention of the names. "How did you—" "Jason told me this morning they were bullying him, and we've had similar issues with them before, if you even remember. Now where are they?" The principal shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Their parents came and collected them earlier. They said the boys weren't feeling well. Malcolm's fist came down hard on the desk, causing the principal to flinch. "You let them go without questioning them?" We didn't have any concrete evidence connecting them to the incident," the principal stammered. "There were no witnesses, and the area where Jason was found isn't covered by CCTV. He was discovered alone, bleeding and unconscious on the playground. He could have fallen." "Fallen?" Malcolm's mind raced, his police training kicking in despite his emotional state. "What about other cameras? Surely you have footage of them entering or leaving the area." The principal nodded hesitantly. "We've secured what footage we have. The police detectives have taken it for their investigation. We shouldn't make baseless accusations, officer. I know you must be—" "You have no idea how I feel, so don't even say that. These aren't baseless accusations. The doctor confirmed there are signs of aggression on Jason's body, and this morning he refused to go to school, admitting he's been bullied." Malcolm leaned in, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Let me make something very clear. If I find out that you or this school have been covering for those boys because of who their parents are, there will be consequences. Do you understand me?" The principal nodded, his face ashen. "Officer Reed, I assure you we want to get to the bottom of this as much as you do. We've implemented stricter anti-bullying measures." "Clearly they're not working," Malcolm snapped. "My son is fighting for his life because of what happened here today, and it's not the first time he's been targeted." The principal's eyes widened in surprise. "It's not. I wasn't aware." Malcolm's anger flared anew. "Wasn't aware or didn't care? I've complained multiple times about Ellum and Edric bullying Jason. They've been tormenting him for months, calling him names, stealing his lunch, cornering him. And now this." The principal seemed to shrink in his chair under the weight of Malcolm's accusations. I'm so sorry, Officer Reed. We'll do everything we can to cooperate with the investigation." Malcolm straightened up, his eyes cold. "You'd better. Because if Jason doesn't make it, I promise you, this school won't escape scrutiny. Every decision you've made, every time you've turned a blind eye to bullying, it will all come to light." As Malcolm turned to leave, the principal called out weakly, "Officer Reed, perhaps we can handle this internally, a family approach." Malcolm paused at the door, turning back with a look of disbelief. "Internally? My son is in a coma. This stopped being an internal matter the moment he was assaulted on your watch." With that, Malcolm stormed out of the office, leaving the principal pale and shaken behind him. As he walked through the school hallways, his anger simmered just below the surface. He was determined to get justice for Jason, to make sure those responsible faced consequences for their actions. But as he reached his car, a wave of exhaustion hit him. The emotional toll of the day was catching up, and he knew he needed to get back to the hospital. Martha would be waiting for news, and he couldn't bear the thought of Jason waking up without both his parents there. As Malcolm drove through the familiar streets of their town, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions and plans. He had intended to head straight to the police station to review the CCTV footage with the detectives, but fate had other ideas. As he passed by a local pizza place, A flash of movement caught his eye. There, stepping out of a sleek SUV, were Elam and Edric, accompanied by their well-dressed parents. The sight of the boys laughing and carefree, while his own son lay fighting for his life in the hospital, sent a surge of rage through Malcolm's body. He pulled over abruptly, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. Through the large windows of the pizza place, he could see the families settling into a booth, the boys jostling each other playfully. The stark contrast between their jovial mood and the gravity of Jason's situation was almost more than Malcolm could bear. As he watched, he saw Edric and Elam approach a small toddler in a stroller, while the child's mother was distracted, talking to another adult. The boys made faces at the child, causing it to cry out in fear. The mother turned quickly, but by then, Edric and Elam had already slipped away, snickering to themselves as they rejoined their parents. The sight pushed Malcolm to the edge of his professional restraint. He stepped out of his patrol car, his hand instinctively resting on his service weapon. Years of pent-up frustration and anger bubbled to the surface. Anger at the racism his family had faced since moving to this neighborhood, anger at the school's inaction, and most of all, anger at himself for not protecting Jason better. As he strode towards the pizza place, dark thoughts swirled in his mind. He imagined confronting the boys and their parents, using his authority as a police officer to make them feel the fear and helplessness that Jason must have felt. His fingers twitched near his holster, the weight of his badge suddenly feeling like both a burden and a shield. But just as he reached for the door handle, a small voice called out, "Look, Mum, there's a police officer." Malcolm turned to see a young white girl in a pink dress, no more than 7 or 8, approaching him with her mother. The child's face was lit up with admiration as she looked at his uniform. "Thank you for protecting America," the girl said earnestly. "Thank you for protecting us." The pure innocence of her gratitude hit Malcolm like a physical force, stopping him in his tracks. In that moment, he saw a glimpse of a world beyond the prejudice and pain he'd been focusing on. A world where people could see beyond color, where a uniform represented protection for all, not just for some. Malcolm's hand fell away from his weapon, and he felt a wave of shame wash over him. What had he been about to do? Confront children in a public place? Abuse his authority as an officer? The very thought of it now made him feel sick. He knelt down to the girl's level, forcing a smile onto his face. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said softly. "You know what? You're my angel today. You just saved me too." The girl and her mother looked confused but pleased by his words. As they walked away, Malcolm stood up slowly, his eyes drifting back to the pizza place window. Inside, Elam and Edric were now seated with their families, oblivious to the drama that had nearly unfolded outside. Malcolm took a deep breath, his mind clearing. He thought about Jason, who had once been as innocent and sweet as the little girl who had just spoken to him. He remembered his son's toddler years, full of laughter and wonder, before the harsh realities of the world had begun to weigh on him. Looking at Elam and Edric through the window, Malcolm realized that revenge would solve nothing. It would only perpetuate the cycle of violence and hatred that had led to this situation in the first place. If he truly wanted justice for Jason, he needed to approach this the right way, through proper legal channels and with a clear head. With a heavy sigh, Malcolm turned away from the pizza place and walked back to his patrol car. As he settled into the driver's seat, he felt a mix of emotions: relief at having avoided a potentially disastrous confrontation, determination to seek justice the right way, and a renewed sense of purpose. He started the engine, his mind now focused on the next steps. He would go to the station, review the CCTV footage, and work with the detectives to build a solid case. He would push for a thorough investigation, not just of this incident, but of the school's handling of bullying cases in general. And most importantly, he would be there for Jason, supporting his son's recovery with love and understanding rather than pressure and expectations. As Malcolm pulled away from the curb, he cast one last glance at the pizza place. The sight of Elam and Edric, still laughing and carefree, no longer filled him with rage. Instead, he felt a sense of resolve. He would fight for justice, but he would do it the right way, not for revenge, but for change. for a world where children like Jason could grow up without fear, where the color of their skin didn't determine how they were treated. With this new determination, Malcolm headed towards the police station. The day had been a roller coaster of emotions, but he felt more centered now, more focused on what truly mattered. As he drove, his thoughts turned back to Jason, hoping against hope that there would be good news waiting for him when he returned to the hospital. Malcolm pulled into the parking lot of the police station and pushed open the heavy door, his eyes scanning the room. The familiar buzz of activity and the hum of conversations surrounded him, but he wasn't here for small talk. His gaze immediately settled on Bradley, who was sitting at a desk, his face taut with concern. The detective, a middle-aged man with sharp features, stood nearby, reviewing a file. "Malcolm," Bradley greeted, rising to his feet. His voice was steady, but the tension in his expression was clear. "I'm so sorry for what happened to you, boy man. Look here, we've got something for you." Malcolm nodded briefly in acknowledgement, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his chest. "I need to see the footage," he said, his voice tight. Bradley motioned for him to follow, and they led him down a narrow hallway into a small, dimly lit room. The detective had already pulled up the CCTV footage from the school, the screen flickering softly in the low light. The grainy image showed Jason walking, his head down, alongside two other boys, Elam and Edric. They were moving through a corridor on the school grounds, their figures blurred but unmistakable. Malcolm's eyes were locked on the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. The footage played on, showing the trio walking together for a few moments, nothing out of the ordinary. He leaned forward slightly, studying the screen, searching for anything that could explain what had happened. But then his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out quickly, his pulse quickening when he saw Martha's name flash on the screen. Without hesitation, he swiped to answer. "Martha!" Malcolm's voice came out strained, as if something was wrong. "Malcolm, we need to talk." Martha's voice trembled on the other end. "It's about Jason. He's not doing well." Malcolm's gaze flickered back to the screen for a moment, the image of Jason walking with Elam and Edric still frozen in his mind. He quickly stepped away from the footage, his attention fully on Martha now. "Is he okay?" Malcolm asked, his voice thick with worry. "The doctor has an update on Jason's condition. The test result is out," Martha said, her voice cracking. "You need to come back to the hospital right away." Malcolm's heart sank. He could feel the panic rising in his chest as he glanced at Bradley and the detective, both of them watching him closely. "I'm on my way," Malcolm said, his voice resolute. He hung up the phone, his eyes locking with Bradley's. "I need to go. I'll be back as soon as I can. Keep me updated on the footage." Bradley gave a solemn nod. "We'll keep working on it. Go be with your family." Malcolm didn't need to hear anything more. He turned on his heel, his steps quick and heavy as he left the room, heading straight for the exit. The weight of the footage of what Jason had been through hung over him like a cloud, but right now nothing mattered more than getting to his son. Without hesitation, Malcolm turned his car around and sped back towards the hospital, his mind racing with possibilities. The drive seemed both interminable and too quick, his emotions swinging wildly between hope and dread. As he rushed through the hospital corridors, Malcolm found Martha standing outside Jason's room, her face pale and drawn. Dr. Flores was with her, a grave expression on her face. "Mr. Reed," Dr. Flores began as Malcolm approached, "we've received the results of Jason's official imaging tests. I'm afraid the news isn't good." Malcolm felt his knees weaken, and he reached out to steady himself against the wall. "What is it?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Flores took a deep breath before continuing. "The fall caused significant damage to Jason's liver. The left lobe has been severely injured, and we believe a liver transplant is necessary." The words hit Malcolm like a physical blow. A transplant? The severity of Jason's condition suddenly became all too real. "Only half of the liver is needed," Dr. Flores explained, her voice gentle but firm. "This is a common procedure when only part of the liver is damaged. The donor's liver will regenerate over time." Martha, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "But neither of us is a match for Jason's blood type. and I couldn't find anyone among our friends or family who would be willing to donate." Dr. Flores nodded solemnly. "That's the challenge we're facing. Finding a suitable donor is crucial, and time is of the essence. The requirements are strict. The donor must have the same blood type as Jason, have a history of frequent blood donations, be in good health, and not have eaten recently if this is to be done fast." Malcolm felt a wave of despair wash over him. The odds seemed insurmountable. What are our options?" he asked, his voice cracking. "We've put Jason on the transplant list," Dr. Flores replied, "but given the urgency of his condition and the specific requirements, it could take some time to find a match, and I'm afraid—" She paused, her professional demeanor slipping for a moment. "I'm not sure how much time Jason has." The weight of those words settled over Malcolm and Martha like a heavy blanket. Their son's life hung in the balance, dependent on finding a donor who met all these specific criteria. Malcolm pulled Martha close, feeling her body shake with silent sobs. He wanted to offer words of comfort, to tell her everything would be all right, but the words stuck in his throat. The reality of their situation was too stark, too painful. As they stood there, clinging to each other outside Jason's room, Malcolm's mind raced. He thought of all the people he knew, wondering if any of them could be a potential match. He thought of the irony of his own AB blood type, known as the universal recipient, but useless in this situation where his son needed a specific type. Dr. Flores gave them a moment before speaking again. "I know this is overwhelming, but please don't lose hope. We're doing everything we can to find a suitable donor. In the meantime, we'll continue to monitor Jason closely and do everything in our power to keep him stable." Malcolm nodded numbly, unable to form words. As Dr. Flores excused herself, promising to return with any updates, Malcolm and Martha turned to look through the window into Jason's room. Their son lay there, small and vulnerable amidst the machines keeping him alive, unaware of the desperate search underway to save his life. In that moment, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of determination. He would move heaven and earth to find a donor for Jason. He would reach out to every contact he had, use every resource at his disposal. His son's life depended on it, and Malcolm was not about to let him down again. With a gentle squeeze of Martha's hand, Malcolm steeled himself for the battle ahead. The search for a liver donor was just beginning, and he was determined to see it through, no matter what it took. Over the next few hours, Malcolm reached out to everyone he knew, close and distant family, relatives, friends, and colleagues. But finding the right person with the necessary blood type, who was also willing to undergo a major operation for the implant, proved far more difficult than he had anticipated. Despite the promises from everyone he contacted to share the news on their social media, the search remained frustratingly elusive. Malcolm paced restlessly in the hospital corridor, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. He couldn't shake the urge to return to the station, to continue reviewing the footage and find answers. But the weight of his responsibility here was undeniable. He couldn't just leave Martha alone, not when she needed him most. Every few steps he glanced at the door to the waiting room, his thoughts torn between his ambitions and his desire to be there for his family. Suddenly Nurse Mulligan appeared, greeting them as she approached. Martha and Malcolm stood up in unison, their faces a mix of conflicting emotions, relief, anxiety, and exhaustion battling for control, hoping for news that the hospital had found a donor. "Nurse," Malcolm called, his voice urgent as he approached, slightly out of breath from his hurry. "Any news? Did they find a donor?" Martha nodded, tears glistening in her eyes, expecting none other than a positive answer. "I heard you are the one who brought Jason in. Please." Before Malcolm could process this information, he noticed that the nurse was not dressed in his formal nurse uniform, but in a hospital gown. Her face was pale but determined. "Officer Reed," she said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "I heard about Jason's condition and what he needs. I want to help. I want to donate part of my liver to your son with your permission." Malcolm stood there, stunned into silence. This woman, whom he had stopped for speeding, was now offering to save his son's life. The enormity of her gesture overwhelmed him. But the risks," he finally managed to say. "This is a major surgery. You could—" "Why? All of a sudden—" Nancy held up a hand, silencing him gently. "I know the risks, Officer Reed, but I also know that without this, Jason might not make it. I'm a match. Same blood type, frequent donor, and I haven't eaten since 6 hours ago. I'm the best chance he has right now. If we wait longer, I'm afraid he won't make it." Martha stepped forward, her voice choked with emotion. "Why? Why would you do this for us?" Nancy's eyes softened, a hint of old pain visible in their depths. "When I was 10, just like Jason, I lost my younger brother. We lived in a small rural town, far from any major hospitals. By the time we got him to a doctor, it was too late. His life could have been saved if we'd had access to proper medical care in time." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "That's why I became a nurse. I wanted to make sure other families didn't have to go through what mine did. When I heard about Jason, about how urgently he needed this transplant, I knew I had to help. This is my chance to make a difference, to save a life in a way I couldn't save my brother's." Malcolm felt tears welling up in his eyes. All the anger and frustration he had been carrying, all the prejudice he thought he'd seen in the world, seemed to melt away in the face of this woman's selfless act. I don't know what to say," he stammered. "Thank you seems so inadequate." Nancy smiled softly. "You don't need to say anything but your permission. Just promise me you'll take care of that boy. He deserves a chance to grow up, to live his life fully." "Our permission?" Malcolm was lost for words. He looked at Martha by his side and she nodded with tears. "Of course, Nurse Mulligan," he said. "You can call me Nancy," she smiled. At that moment, Dr. Flores approached, her face serious but with a hint of hope. "We're ready to begin the procedure," she announced. "Nurse Mulligan, are you absolutely certain about this?" Nancy nodded without hesitation. "I am. Let's do this." As the medical team prepared to take Nancy into surgery and worked around Jason, Malcolm and Martha clung to each other, overwhelmed by the nurse's sacrifice and the sudden hope for their son's survival. "I'll see you on the other side," Nancy said with a brave smile as she was wheeled towards the operating room. Malcolm watched her go, a lump in his throat. He turned to Martha, seeing his own mix of fear and hope reflected in her eyes. "She's risking her life for our son," he said softly. "After everything that's happened, all the hatred and prejudice we've seen, it's a white nurse willing to do this for Jason." Martha nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It's a miracle, Malcolm. A real miracle." As they settled in for the long wait ahead, Malcolm felt a shift in his perspective. The world wasn't just full of bullies and indifferent bureaucrats. There were also people like Nancy, willing to make incredible sacrifices for others. It was a reminder that goodness existed, that hope was always possible. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as the surgery began. Malcolm and Martha held each other close, their prayers and hopes focused on the operating room where their son's life hung in the balance, saved by the incredible kindness of a stranger. After hours of waiting outside the operation room, finally Martha spoke up. "Malcolm, I need to know what happened at the school," Martha said suddenly, her voice firm but filled with concern. "Will you come with me? It's only 3 p.m, the school's still open. Maybe we can visit the playground, see for ourselves where everything happened. What do you think?" Malcolm looked at her, his mind still reeling from the chaos of the last few hours, but he saw the determination in her eyes and nodded. "Yeah, let's go. We need answers. I didn't visit the playground earlier. I was not ready for it, but with you here, I think I can do it." They made their way to the nurse's station to inform them of their departure. The nurse, who was busy tending to charts, glanced up with a calm expression. "The surgery will take another 3 hours," she said, her voice steady. "We'll keep you updated if anything changes. Just let us know if you need anything." Malcolm and Martha exchanged a quick glance before Malcolm nodded in acknowledgement. "We'll be back soon. Thank you." With that, they turned and left the hospital, stepping into the bright afternoon light. The tension between them was palpable, neither knowing exactly what they would find at the school, but both feeling the weight of unanswered questions pressing on their minds. As they drove, the streets seemed to stretch on endlessly, each minute feeling heavier than the last. The quiet between them was filled with unspoken thoughts, fears for Jason's recovery, worries about the truth behind the bullying. Malcolm stood at the school's entrance, his mind still spinning from the ongoing surgery as he checked his phone repeatedly while walking down the corridor. As he neared the doors, he spotted the principal stepping out of his office. The man's face drained of color when he saw Malcolm approaching. "Officer Reed," the principal said, his voice nervous. I didn't expect to see you back so soon. How is Jason?" Malcolm's jaw tightened. "He's in recovery. No thanks to the lack of action from this school." The principal flinched at Malcolm's tone. "Officer Reed, I assure you, we take bullying very seriously. Perhaps we could discuss this further in my office." Malcolm shook his head. "No, I'm not here to talk about this again. My wife and I want to see the playground where it happened, and I need to speak with the teacher who made the report." The principal hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Of course. Mr. Deblaus was the teacher who found Jason. He teaches in the secondary school building, which is under a different administration, and the old playground where he found Jason was also in that building. This elementary building connects through a narrow lane, but I can take you to the playground and fetch him for you." As they walked towards the abandoned playground, the principal called over Jason's homeroom teacher, Ms. Catherine, when he saw her, asking her to accompany them while he went to find Mr. Deblaus. Ms. Catherine led them through a narrow passage, explaining to them that this section that connects the elementary and the secondary school building should be off-limit to student. They reached at the playground where Jason had been injured. It was cordoned off with police tape, a stark reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded there. Malcolm stood at the edge of the tape, his eyes scanning the area, trying to piece together what had happened to his son. The playground looked like it had been abandoned for a long time. Miss Catherine broke the silence, her voice trembling slightly. "Officer Reed, there's something you should know. I was aware that Elam and Edric have targeted Jason." Malcolm turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Miss Catherine glanced nervously in the direction the principal had gone before continuing. "They've been bullying Jason for months, forcing him to do their homework, stealing his lunch, cornering him in the hallways. I've reported it multiple times and tried to separate them, but—" She trailed off. Malcolm felt a surge of anger. "But what?" "But Elam and Edric's parents are major donors to the school," Ms. Catherine admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "The administration has been hesitant to take strong action against them." Before Malcolm could respond, Mr. Deblaus arrived with the principal, slightly out of breath. "Officer Reed," he said, extending his hand, "I'm so sorry about what happened to Jason. How is he doing?" Malcolm shook the PE teacher's hand, his mind still grappling with Ms. Catherine's revelation. "He's in surgery right now," Malcolm explained, his voice tight. "There's liver damage from the fall and a concussion. Thankfully, we found someone who was kind enough to volunteer as a donor." Ms. Catherine's hand flew to her mouth in shock. "Oh my God, I had no idea it was that serious." Mr. Deblaus shrugged and looked surprised even in his silence. Martha nodded, his attention now fully focused on the PE teacher. "Mr. Deblaus, can you tell me and my husband exactly what you saw?" Mr. Deblaus nodded solemnly. "I can't stop thinking about it. If only I had gotten here sooner." He took a deep breath, his face pale with the memory. "I was passing by this area to grab some equipment from the PE storage room nearby. At first I saw Jason on top of the bench over there." He pointed to a set of concrete steps leading up to a raised platform. He seemed to be performing or dancing, but then suddenly he was struggling against two other boys. "Elam and Edric?" Malcolm asked, though he already knew the answer. Mr. Deblaus nodded. "I believe so, yes, it all happened so fast. I shouted at them from where I was, asking them why they are here and not in class, but before I could get there, they pushed Jason. He rolled down the steps and hit that rock at the bottom." He pointed to a large, jagged stone at the base of the steps. Malcolm felt sick as he imagined the scene. What happened next? "The two boys ran off, shouting something about Jason being a coward," Mr. Deblaus continued. "I rushed over to Jason. He was conscious at first, saying, 'Help, Dad,' and 'sorry.' I didn't realize how badly he was hurt at first. There wasn't much visible blood, and he was trying to get up." "So what did you do?" Malcolm pressed, his voice tight with emotion. I I went to get the first aid kit from the infirmary, Mr. Deblaus admitted, his voice filled with regret. When I came back, Jason had lost consciousness, and there was so much blood. That's when I called emergency services. Malcolm nodded, taking in the information. He turned to Ms. Catherine. And you say this bullying has been going on for months? Ms. Catherine nodded, her eyes filling with tears. I've tried to intervene, to report it, but... She glanced towards the school building. The administration always seemed to find excuses not to take serious action. Malcolm's fists clenched at his sides. I see. Just then the principal spoke up, looking nervous. Officer Reed, perhaps we could continue this discussion in my office. Find a way to handle this internally as I offered. The school's reputation... Malcolm turned to the principal, his voice low and dangerous. I've told you I did not intend to handle this internally. This stopped being an unsafe matter the moment my son was assaulted on your watch. And your reputation, that's what you're worried about. My son almost died because of what happened here. The principal paled further, realizing the gravity of his misstep. I didn't mean... Of course, Jason's well-being is our primary concern, but surely we can find a way to address this situation without involving the media or legal action. Malcolm stepped closer to the principal, his voice low and controlled, but filled with intensity. Let me be very clear. My son has internal bleeding. His liver was damaged, and he needed a transplant. He could have died at any moment. And you want me to settle this issue internally? The principal, Mr. Deblaus, and Ms. Catherine all stood in shocked silence. Malcolm continued, his gaze sweeping over the mature man. This isn't about protecting reputations anymore. This is about justice and making sure no other child has to go through what Jason did. Mr. Deblaus stepped forward, his face set with determination. Officer Reed, I want you to know that I'm willing to testify about what I saw, no matter the consequences. Ms. Catherine nodded in agreement. Me too. I'll testify about Elam and Edric's behavior and the school's lack of action. It's time someone stood up to this. The principal looked from Mr. Deblaus to Ms. Catherine, then back to Malcolm, realizing he was quickly losing control of the situation. Officer Reed, please, think about what this could do to the school, to the community. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. What this could do to the school? What about what it's already done to my son? To other kids who've been bullied? No, it's time for change, and if that means shaking things up, then so be it. He turned to the principal, his voice carrying a note of finality. If you want to save any shred of this school's reputation, you'd better start cooperating fully with the investigation. Money and influence can only protect those boys so far. The law is on our side, and I intend to see justice done. The principal opened his mouth to protest further, but Malcolm cut him off. That's something for you to think about. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get back. As Malcolm prepared to leave, Martha's phone rang. They both tensed at recognizing the hospital's number. Martha stepped aside and picked up the phone. Malcolm looked around the playground area, imagining what had happened that day. Now he wants so badly to contact Bradley for any update regarding the CCTV footage. Malcolm, Martha's voice was filled with excitement. The surgery's done. The nurse say the surgery is going to be concluded in 1 hour. We need to come back to the hospital right away and be ready. Tell them we'll be there in 10 minutes. Malcolm's heart leapt in his chest. Let's go, he said, already pacing up toward the corridor. As Malcolm walked away, he could hear the principal's panicked whispers to Mr. Deblaus and Ms. Catherine, but he paid them no mind. His focus was now entirely on getting back to the hospital, back to Jason. He and Martha climbed into the patrol car, his mind racing with everything he had learned. The school's negligence, the ongoing bullying, the attempt to cover it all up. It was worse than he had imagined. But now, with Mr. Deblaus and Ms. Catherine willing to testify, there was a real chance for justice. As he sped towards the hospital, Malcolm's mind raced. The truth about what had happened to Jason was finally coming to light, and now there was hope for his recovery. But he knew the fight was far from over. There would be a long road ahead. Jason's recovery, the legal battle against Elam and Edric and their families, and the push for real change at the school. But for now, all that mattered was getting to the hospital. His son needed him, and this time he will be there for him. The hospital came into view, and Malcolm felt a surge of anticipation. He was ready to face whatever came next. As he parked his car and they hurried towards the hospital entrance, Malcolm made a silent vow. He would be the father Jason needed, not just a protector, but a listener, a supporter, someone Jason could trust with his fears and struggles. The mistakes of the past couldn't be undone, but the future was still unwritten, and Malcolm was determined to make it a better one for his son. The hospital waiting room was a study in tension and hope as Malcolm and Martha sat side by side, their hands clasped tightly together. The clock on the wall seemed to move at an agonizingly slow pace, each tick a reminder of the critical surgery taking place behind closed doors. Malcolm's mind raced with the events of the past few days, the bullying, the accident, the desperate search for a donor, and now the miraculous offer from Nurse Nancy. He couldn't help but marvel at the twist of fate that had brought them to this point. "I still can't believe she's doing this," Martha whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "After everything that's happened, all the hatred and prejudice we've seen, it's a white nurse willing to risk her life for our son." Malcolm nodded, his own eyes misting over. "It's a reminder that there's still good in the world, Martha. That kindness can come from the most unexpected places." As the hours ticked by, Malcolm found himself reflecting on his own actions and attitudes. The anger he had felt towards the school, towards the bullies and their parents, even towards the system that had seemed to fail his son. It all paled in comparison to the selfless act of sacrifice they were witnessing. During the 30 minutes of waiting, Malcolm's phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Bradley, his superior officer, updating him on the investigation at the school. The CCTV footage revealed Elam and Edric pushing Jason toward the playground, despite his clear resistance. However, the actual incident wasn't caught on camera. There were recordings showing the boys walking back without Jason, just minutes after Mr. DeBlaus's voice was heard in the PE storeroom CCTV. Malcolm quickly typed a response, explaining that Mr. DeBlaus and Ms. Catherine was willing to testify about seeing the boys flee and overhearing their conversation. It could prove to be crucial evidence. Malcolm shared this information with Martha, his voice low. "We'll press charges against the boys and their parents, make them cover the cost of Jason's treatment, and they need to be expelled from that school." Martha nodded, her face set with determination. "It's going to be a hard fight, Malcolm. Those families have money and influence." "I know," Malcolm replied, his jaw clenching. "But we're not going down without a fight. Jason deserves justice, and so do all the other kids who've been bullied." As they lapsed back into anxious silence, Malcolm found his thoughts turning to Jason. He remembered his son's reluctance that fateful morning, the signs of bullying he had dismissed, his own harsh words pushing Jason to toughen up. The guilt was a heavy weight in his chest. "I failed him, Martha," Malcolm said softly, his voice cracking. "I should have listened to him, should have protected him better." Martha squeezed his hand. "We both made mistakes, Malcolm, but we can't change the past. What matters now is how we move forward, how we support Jason through his recovery." Malcolm nodded, drawing strength from his wife's words. He made a silent vow to be a better father, to listen more and judge less, to be the support Jason needed, rather than the disciplinarian he thought his son should have. Just as the clock ticked past the 8th hour, the door to the operating room opened. Dr. Flores emerged, her surgical mask pulled down, revealing a tired but hopeful expression. Malcolm and Martha stood up immediately, their hearts pounding in unison. "Mr. and Mrs. Reed," Dr. Flores began, her voice carrying a note of cautious optimism, "I'm pleased to tell you that the surgery was successful. Both Jason and Nurse Nancy have come through the procedure well." The relief that washed over Malcolm and Martha was palpable. They clung to each other, tears flowing freely. Dr. Flores continued, "Jason is currently in the ICU, still under general anesthesia. We'll be monitoring his vital signs closely and watching for any signs of complications. It's likely he'll remain unconscious for the next 24 to 72 hours as his body begins the healing process." "And Nurse Nancy?" Malcolm asked, his voice thick with emotion. "She's in recovery as well," Dr. Flores replied with a small smile. The procedure was extensive, but she's stable. Her sacrifice has given Jason the best possible chance at recovery. As Dr. Flores excused herself to check on her patients, Malcolm and Martha embraced, the tension of the past hours finally releasing in a flood of tears and whispered thanks. "He's going to be okay," Martha murmured, her face buried in Malcolm's chest. "Our boy is going to be okay." Malcolm held his wife tightly, his mind already racing ahead to the challenges that lay before them. Jason's recovery, the legal battle ahead, the changes they needed to make as a family. But for now, in this moment, all that mattered was that Jason had survived, that they had been given another chance. As they prepared to see their son in the ICU, Malcolm silently renewed his vow to be the father Jason needed. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but they would face it together, as a family, stronger and more united than ever before. The soft beeping of medical equipment filled the hospital room as Malcolm and Martha kept their vigil by Jason's bedside, ever since he had been pushed in and connected to the monitors. They spent the night sleeping restlessly on the small couch in the corner, neither willing to leave their son's side for even a moment. As the first rays of morning sunlight began to filter through the blinds, Malcolm stirred, his body aching from the uncomfortable sleeping position. He glanced at Martha, who was already awake, her eyes fixed on Jason's still form. "Any change?" Malcolm asked softly, his voice rough with sleep. Martha shook her head. "Not yet, but the nurse who came in earlier said his vitals are looking good." Malcolm nodded, stretching as he stood up. "I'm going to grab us some coffee from the cafeteria. Do you want anything else?" Before Martha could answer, a small movement caught their attention. Jason's hand, which they had been holding throughout the night, twitched slightly. "Jason," Martha called out, her voice trembling with hope. "Honey, can you hear us?" Slowly, Jason's eyes fluttered open, blinking against the soft light of the room. His gaze, unfocused at first, eventually settled on his parents' faces. "Mum, Dad?" His voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from disuse and the breathing tube that had been removed only hours earlier. Malcolm and Martha were at his side in an instant, tears of joy and relief streaming down their faces. "We're here, son," Malcolm said, his voice choked with emotion. "You're safe now. You're going to be okay." A nurse, alerted by the change in Jason's vitals, entered the room. After a quick examination, she smiled at the family. "This is a good sign. I'll let Dr. Flores know he's awake." As the nurse left, Jason's grip on his parents' hands tightened slightly. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. "I'm sorry." "Oh, honey, you have nothing to be sorry for," Martha soothed, gently stroking his hair. Malcolm felt a lump form in his throat. "No, Jason, I'm the one who should be sorry. I didn't listen to you. I didn't understand how bad things were at school. But I promise you, things are going to be different now." Asen's eyes, still heavy with fatigue, searched his father's face. "Different how?" he asked weakly. Malcolm took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I promise I'll listen to you more, son. I won't push you to be something you're not. And we're going to make sure those boys who hurt you face consequences for what they did." Jason's brow furrowed slightly. "Elam and Edric? What's going to happen to them?" Before Malcolm could answer, Dr. Flores entered the room, her face lighting up when she saw Jason awake. "Well, look who's decided to join us," she said warmly. "How are you feeling, Jason?" As Dr. Flores began her examination, Malcolm and Martha stepped back, giving her room to work. They watched anxiously as she checked Jason's vitals and asked him a series of questions to assess his cognitive function. Finally, Dr. Flores turned to them with a smile. "He's doing remarkably well, all things considered. The transplant seems to be taking, and his body is responding positively. We'll need to keep him here for a while longer for observation, but I'm optimistic about his recovery." The relief that washed over Malcolm and Martha was palpable. They thanked Dr. Flores profusely as she left the room, promising to return later for another checkup. As they settled back at Jason's bedside, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of purpose. He turned to his son, his voice gentle but firm. "Jason, I want you to know that what happened to you wasn't your fault. Those boys, Ellum and Edric, they did a terrible thing, and they're going to face consequences for it. Jason's eyes widened slightly. Are they going to jail? Malcolm shook his head. No, son, they're too young for that. But they will be held accountable. We're going to make sure they're expelled from school, and their families will have to pay for your medical treatment. Martha added softly, and we're going to make sure the school changes its policies so that bullying like this doesn't happen to anyone else. Jason nodded slowly, processing this information. After a moment, he asked, Dad, do you remember when you told me I needed to be brave and stand up for myself? Malcolm felt a pang of guilt. Yes, son, I remember. I tried, Jason said, his voice barely above a whisper. When they cornered me on the playground, I tried to use those self-defense moves you taught me. But there were 2 of them, and they were bigger. Malcolm felt tears stinging his eyes. He gently squeezed Jason's hand. You were brave, Jason. So brave. I'm sorry I put that pressure on you. It wasn't fair and it wasn't right. From now on, if anyone tries to hurt you, I want you to tell us or a teacher right away. You don't have to face these things alone. Jason's eyes filled with tears, but there was a glimmer of relief in them too. Really? You won't be disappointed if I don't fight back? Never, Malcolm said firmly. Your safety and happiness are what matter most. I'm so proud of you, son. Not because you tried to fight back, but because you're kind and smart and strong in ways that have nothing to do with fighting. Martha leaned in, kissing Jason's forehead. We love you so much, sweetheart, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. As Jason drifted back to sleep, exhausted from the conversation, Malcolm and Martha exchanged a look of determination. They knew the road ahead would be challenging. Jason's recovery, the legal battles, the push for change at the school, but they were ready to face it together, as a family. Malcolm stood up, stretching his tired muscles. I'm going to call Bradley, get an update on the investigation, and then I think we should visit Nurse Nancy, thank her properly for what she did for Jason. Martha nodded in agreement. Yes, we owe her so much. She's part of our family now, in a way. As Malcolm stepped out into the hallway to make his call, he felt a sense of renewed purpose. The truth about what had happened to Jason was out, and now it was time to ensure that justice was served. But more than that, it was time to heal. Not just Jason's physical wounds, but the emotional scars that had been left on their family. They made their way to the nurses' station, where a kind-faced nurse greeted them. Can I help you? She asked. Yes, Malcolm replied. We're looking for Nurse Nancy Mulligan. She donated part of her liver to our son. The nurse's face softened with recognition. Ah, yes, Nancy's room is just down the hall, room 305. She's been asking about your son. I'm sure she'll be glad to see you. Following the nurse's directions, Malcolm and Martha found themselves outside room 305. They knocked gently, and a tired but cheerful voice called out, Come in. As they entered, they saw Nancy propped up in her bed, looking pale but alert. Her face brightened when she saw them. Mr. and Mrs. Reed, she said warmly. How's Jason doing? Martha rushed to Nancy's bedside, taking her hand. He's awake, Nancy. He's doing so well thanks to you. We can't even begin to thank you for what you've done. Malcolm nodded, his voice thick with emotion. You saved our son's life. We'll never be able to repay you for that. Nancy smiled softly. Seeing Jason recover is all the payment I need. I became a nurse to help people, to save lives. Being able to do that for Jason, it means everything to me. Tears welled up in Martha's eyes. You're an angel, Nancy. A true angel. Malcolm stepped closer, his expression serious. Nancy, what you did, it's taught me so much. About sacrifice, about true service to the community. I thought I understood what it meant to protect and serve as a police officer, but you've shown me a whole new level of compassion. Nancy's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I just did what I hope anyone would do in my position. Jason deserves a chance to grow up, to live his life fully. Martha squeezed Nancy's hand. And he will, thanks to you. You're part of our family now, Nancy. Your liver is inside Jason, keeping him alive. If there's ever anything you need, anything at all, we want you to know you can come to us. Nancy nodded, clearly moved by their words. "Thank you, that means more than you know." As they continued to talk, sharing stories and expressing their gratitude, Malcolm felt a sense of purpose solidifying within him. The events of the past few days had shaken his worldview, challenging his preconceptions and forcing him to reevaluate his priorities. When they finally left Nancy's room, both Malcolm and Martha felt a renewed sense of hope and determination. They had witnessed firsthand the power of compassion and selflessness, and it had changed them profoundly. As they walked back to Jason's room, Malcolm knew that this experience would shape not only how he approached his role as a father, but also how he served his community as a police officer. The challenges ahead were still daunting, but with the inspiration of Nancy's sacrifice and the love of his family, Malcolm felt ready to face them head-on. He vowed to himself that he would be the father Jason needed, the husband Martha deserved, and the kind of police officer who truly protected and served his community. The challenges ahead were daunting, but Malcolm was ready to face them head-on, with love, determination, and a newfound understanding of what truly mattered in life.